Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Jenny. I'm from Jenny Card Designs, and thank you so much for stopping by to spend some time with me here today. My YouTube channel has been created to share paper crafting tutorials and inspiration with all of you. I hope that you enjoy. In today's video, we'll be continuing on with our series Card Making Basics, the Breakdown. So far, we've covered cardstock and envelopes. And if you haven't had a chance to check out any of those videos, I will link to a playlist at the top of the screen here. And this week we'll be covering inks. This video is solely my own opinions and experiences. There are tons of people that are extremely knowledgeable when it comes to ink pads. I'm just a crafter. I'm just a mom, and I'm a regular person that likes to craft and make YouTube videos. So these are solely just my ideas and opinions, and I just want to share them with you. So hopefully you might find some information that's useful within my video here today. There are a lot of places that you can get a lot more information, and I'll link to some of those places in the description below so that if you're looking for some more detailed info on any of the things that I talk about here today, you'll be able to find them in the links down below. So starting off with the types of ink pads. There are so many kinds. I mean, they're coming out with new stuff all the time because, science is amazing. We'll start with 3 different types of ink that we'll go over today: dye ink, pigment ink, and hybrid ink. And we'll just talk about a little bit of the properties, and I'll give you a few samples of the different types of ink pads and maybe what they might be used for. So let's start with dye ink. So some of the properties that you may want to know about dye ink is that it absorbs into the paper. It dries very quickly. Many inks have a smoothing agent inside of the ink so that when you first stamp it, it may look a little splotchy, and then it'll smooth out as it absorbs into the paper. And also the ink pad color may look different than the stamped image when the image is dried. They tend to fade back a little bit into the paper. And some examples of those types of inks are Tina K Designs, Lawn Fawn, and Hero Arts. And all 3 of those companies have a wonderful selection of ink colors. So the next type of ink that we'll talk about is a pigment ink. One of the most defining properties of pigment ink is that they are opaque, and which means basically you can't see through it. I always forget what opaque means, if it means it's see-through or not. Maybe you do too, maybe you're just like me, but so pigment can't see through it, whereas dye you can kind of see behind it. Let's say if you have a stamped image and you want to stamp color over it, you'll be able to see the darker color behind it. Whereas a pigment ink, when you stamp over top of it, you can't really see through it. It's pretty solid. For the most part, both of the types of inks, dye inks and pigment inks, are fade resistant. Pigment ink tends to resist the light better over time, and the pigment inks are typically brighter and more vibrant, and the color stays pretty much the same as what's on the ink pad. So when you stamp it, the color will stay similar to what's on the wet pad as when it's dried on the paper. Now, pigment inks can be either oil-based or water-based. An example of an oil-based pigment ink is VersaFine Onyx Black or VersaFine Clear. An example of a water-based pigment ink is Colorbox. Now there's a third ink, which is a hybrid ink, and a hybrid ink is a combination of pigment and dye ink. So they carry some properties of each of the inks. For example, they typically dry fast and fade resistant and can be more opaque than a typical dye ink depending on the brand or manufacturer. An example of a hybrid ink is my favorite things, Simon Says Stamp, and also Distress Oxide. Distress Oxide ink kind of lands funny a little bit. It is mostly pigment-based ink, but it also has dye ink fused into it. So it's kind of a mix of both. So I would consider it a hybrid ink because it's not 100% pigment and it's not 100% dye. It's kind of mixed in the middle. So it takes a little bit longer to dry. It reacts with water, and it is opaque when stamped. This type of ink you can layer on top of each other and be able to see the true color without the two mixing together too much. I want to talk about one more type of ink, and it's called Amalgam Ink. I decided to give this ink a category. I just kind of felt like it deserved it. I didn't know where this ink sort of landed in the spectrum of names. It's a hybrid, it's a dye, it's a mix. I'm not sure, but it's definitely something special. Gina K has a whole line of amalgam inks that you can use for a multitude of things. She has them in a variety of colors so that you can use them with all of your card projects and stamping needs. This type of ink, when dried, it works with all of the mediums and it doesn't smudge. So on screen here, I just want to show you some of the techniques and the amalgam ink's resistance to the techniques. So I've grabbed a paintbrush and some water, and I've swiped the image with the water, and then I have used alcohol markers and run my colorless blender down through each one of the amalgam inks just to show you that none of the inks smudge. I used my heat tool and dried up the surface so that you could see that the inks were perfectly intact. So these amalgam inks are inks that I use every day. They're my go-to, especially the Obsidian Black amalgam ink. It's my favorite, and I highly recommend this ink pad. Its formula is fantastic. So we've got everything stamped out here from all of the samples that we went through, and I also went ahead and stamped all of the same inks on a piece of Canson XL watercolor paper so that we can test everything out. So I've grabbed a paintbrush and dipped it in some clean water. I'll just put some water droplets over top of the stamped images so that we can see which ones react with the water, and by react I mean change the color of this ink or move it around, and which ones resist it. I'll just use my microfiber cloth to pick up the excess water, and we'll take a close-up look here. So you can see the Distress Oxide inks in the hybrid category reacted with the water, and then the Simon Says stamp and the My Favorite Things did not. The Pigment Ink, only the white Pigment Ink reacted with the water, and that was a water-based ink, and the oil-based one didn't, which is the VersaFine Onyx Black. And then for the dye inks, the Gina K Designs and the Lawn Fawn both reacted, and the Hero Arts did not. The next test we're going to perform is with some alcohol ink. So I'm using my Copic alcohol marker, and I'm just going to color over top of the stamped image just to see if we get any smudging or bleeding of the ink or any mixing with the alcohol ink. So for the most part, all three dye inks are just fine. Now you may have some varying results, but for my test here today, my Lawn Fawn, my Gina K, and my Hero Arts ink pads work just fine with some Copic markers. Now we'll test it out with the hybrid inks, and the first one I've got a Simon Says stamp, and that seemed to be just fine. My Favorite Things, that one was just fine as well. I didn't have any issues with any bleeding or smudging. And then the Distress Oxide ink, I used the same color. I used a yellow here. I was a little leery. I wasn't confident that my alcohol marker wouldn't smudge the oxide ink since it reacts with water. I thought for sure it was going to smudge. It seemed to do okay, but I mean that one's still kind of up in the air. But definitely Pigment Ink for sure is not a no-go for alcohol markers. It smudges, and I know this already, so I'm not even going to bother dipping my alcohol markers into those pigment inks because they definitely do bleed. Now this test may not be the most valid for alcohol markers because typically we stamp with a black ink pad and then color in with the Copics or whatever alcohol marker you have. But I mean, just in case you want to do no line coloring or anything like that, it works with these ink pads, so I hope that helps. So if you're new to stamping and card making, I would suggest just starting off small. Buy a couple of ink pads or even small ink cubes from different manufacturers or places, but make sure you buy them in colors that you like and that you're going to use. So try out a few different things before you invest any money in any serious collection of ink pads. You may find out that you don't even need colored ink pads because you enjoy coloring more than you do stamping. I am the very opposite. I love stamping. I have, I think, 170 something ink pads in a rainbow of colors because I really truly enjoy the stamping aspect of what I do. I do have a variety of different coloring tools, watercolors, alcohol markers, colored pencils, and such, but my favorite is stamping. So you really have to know what kind of crafter you are and what influences you the most. Now, I'm not saying that you need to know this stuff right away. It takes time to learn what your favorites are and what your preferences are, but eventually you'll know, like for me, I know what kind of card maker I am and what I enjoy doing. So my only suggestion is to not throw your money away on stuff that you're just not 100% sure of. Test things out, try things. If you have some crafty friends, maybe they have something that you're really interested in, you can check out their stash and see if anything that they have might be interesting that you might be willing to try. So I hope that this information has been a little bit helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments below, or you can contact me on my social media links. So thank you so much for taking time out of your day to spend it here with me. I really appreciate all of the support. If you like this content, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Tune in next Monday to our 4th installment of Card Making Basics, the breakdown, where we'll be talking about tools and some of the most used tools and the things that you may need as a beginner crafter, or you've been thinking about and just not sure, sitting on the fence. I have a whole slew of tools to go over, and basically what you need to get started and what things that you should consider investing in if you intend on really spending your time and money on this hobby that we all love so much. So again, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.